In the lesson for April the 3rd, we're going to look at Acts chapter 4. So if you'll turn to that passage, we're going to dig into it in just a moment. When I was still a pastor at First Baptist Church in Richardson, Texas, we developed a partnership with the Christians in Latvia, particularly with the Valandis Baptist Church in Riga, Latvia. And I made 3 or 4 trips over there during that period of time. Got to know a lot of the Christians who were there in Latvia, and it was inspiring to be able to meet them. They were living in a territory that had been under communist domination up until the end of the Cold War, which is 1989. And so we started this partnership like in 1996. So for just a few years, they had been out from under the control of communism, and I was impressed by the simplicity and the fervency of their commitment to Christ. But what really intrigued me was the stories of their parents and their grandparents who lived as Christians under communist domination. Many of them told stories of being imprisoned and persecuted, physically persecuted for their faith. And yet they had remained faithful during those difficult times. Now, we in America don't know anything about that kind of religious persecution. It's a part of our country that we have been able to practice our faith. Not so in other countries. So it's a little bit harder for us to identify with what happens in our text for today in Acts chapter 4, where these men are arrested and flogged and persecuted because of their faith. But even today, there are Christians who are going through this. So maybe we can identify with it through that, recognizing that even today there are Christians who are going through what we're going to read about in our lesson for the day in Acts chapter 4. In the first verse of Acts chapter 4, we're introduced to a cast of characters around whom the story now will unfold. So let's look at this cast of characters. First of all, there are the priests. Of course, these are what we might call the custodians of the temple, custodians of the synagogue, not the temple, of the synagogue and the temple, to keep things going in terms of the Jewish religion. So they're the religious leaders who want to keep everything settled so that they can continue to practice their particular faith. Then we read about the captain of the temple guard. This is not a religious figure. This is, we might call, a political figure. This is the Roman police, the security police. And the purpose of these guards is to keep things calm and settled so that Rome will not intervene with the life that they have set out for themselves. So we have the religious leaders, the priests, we have the political representation in these security guards. And then he mentions the Sadducees. Now they are one of the religious sects of first century Palestine, and they are associated with the old patrician families of Jerusalem. You might call them the conservative wing of the Jewish religion. They are therefore connected to the temple guard, whose responsibility it is to keep things calm in the temple, and they are also closely related to the priests, who are the custodians of the religious life in the temple. So we see this unholy triad between these 3 groups now who are going to come against or bear pressure against the fledgling Christian movement that the book of Acts tells about. Peter and John are also introduced to us in that first verse. Peter and John, of course, are 2 of the chief disciples. They play a key role in the opening chapters in the book of Acts. They preach, they draw a crowd, and these religious and political leaders are going to react against them. And then the 4th character in verse number 1 is, in verse number 2, well, actually it's in the story, in the passage that goes before it, the other character is the person who has been healed. And we'll go back in chapter 3 and read about him in just a moment, because he is the reason for this conflict. The man is healed, Peter and John preach, the crowds respond, and now these three, the Sadducees, the temple guard, and the priest, will react against the disciples. So that's the overview of the passage and the story that we're going to be looking at. The story begins with an arrest, and we'll look at that now beginning in verse 2. Now, why has the crowd gathered around Peter and John? Why are Peter and John preaching to them, and why do these religious and political leaders come and arrest them? Well, to get the answer to that question, we have to go back